So today I'm going to be talking about creating balance. And when I talk about balance, I'm talking about balance in treatment of ADHD and or management, right? So sometimes management feels like a better word. I think oftentimes, the person themselves who has ADHD, they're managing their ADHD, right? I almost see them as like the advocate for themselves of kind of figuring out all the different pieces. And treatment may be a piece of it, but it's not going to be the whole thing. So really we're talking about the management and creating balance within that management. We're going to be talking about the regulatory, the practical, and the emotional, which I see as kind of being the whole picture. As Claire and Bailey said, I'm Marcy Caldwell. These are all my places. You already got all that. I'm not going to bore you with it again. Today, we're going to be talking about the ADHD symptom triad, and we're going to be talking about how to create balanced ADHD management, what that looks like, why it's important. We're also going to be talking about how to tell when ADHD management is out of balance and some strategies for finding balance. We're going to get very specific about those strategies and exactly what helps for kind of what type of out of balance. And then we're going to go into some examples of what it looks like when treatment is out of balance, because as I said, management and treatment are a little different, and both management and treatment can fall out of balance. So we're going to look at them both. Balance is not something that you stumble upon, right? I love this quote from Jana Kingsford because I think, we often think in our society that balance is something that is either going to like fall on us from the heavens or something that we're going to stumble upon if we're kind of lucky enough or if all the stars align. But it's not something we stumble upon. It's something that we have to actively create. It's something that we have to work our way towards. And just like when we're balancing, let's say we're standing on one foot and trying to balance, it doesn't last for long. And that's okay. It's one of those things that we strive for, and that the natural way of balance is that we fall out of it and into it and out and in and out and in, but that it's something that we want to be kind of mindful of and aware of when we're out of it, and aware of kind of what's causing us to get out of it, right? Sometimes we need to dive deep into something and be a little out of balance for a little while. That's okay. We just need to come back to it. So I am having a hard time advancing. Sorry about that. There are 3 components of the ADHD symptom triad. There's regulation, practical, and emotional. And we're going to dive into what all of those are. So the regulation is that basic neurobiological underpinning of an ADHD brain. I like to think of ADHD brains as having a whole bunch of on-off switches. So a more neurotypical brain would look a little bit like one of those big soundboards at a fancy sound studio, with lots and lots of fader or dimmer switches. An ADHD brain would have just as many switches, but instead of fader switches, they would all be on-off switches, right? Because the ADHD brain does a great job turning on. It does a great job turning off. It has a hard time balancing somewhere in the middle. And this is kind of its basic neurobiological root, right? It's caused from the dopamine deficiency within the prefrontal cortex, and it impacts our brain's ability to control and regulate all of its functions. And so that means focus, that means attention, that means activation and kind of initiating a task. So ADHD brains do a really great job going all in, right? They can hyper focus and do amazing, beautiful things. They can be energetic as all get out, right? They can go all in on these things, and they can go all out, right? be hyper-focused or not focused at all. They can, get super excited and passionate about something or feel really disengaged. It's that middle ground that ADHD brains kind of naturally have a harder time with. The practical is how those regulation issues show up in everyday life. So this can be planning, prioritizing, procrastination, time management, all the things that we think of as kind of the day-to-day symptoms of ADHD, that falls in that practical category, right? This is where those on-off switches then kind of show up and show themselves to the rest of the world. So an on-off switch with difficulty with initiation and kind of activation, getting going on something, is going to cause some procrastination issues, right? If that switch doesn't flip until there's enough time pressure, then procrastination is going to be a pretty favorite strategy. That's an example of the way that regulation starts to kind of show up in that practical context. Then we have the emotional. The emotional aspect of ADHD, I often refer to as the emotional roller coaster, right? Sometimes we don't talk about this enough. I don't think nearly enough. In fact, it's not even in the DSM as part of the definition of ADHD. But the emotional impact of ADHD is just as strong, sometimes stronger, than the other aspects of ADHD. And it comes from kind of two places, or I see it as coming from two places. One is from the on-off switch, because just like our brains kind of have this on-off switch for attention or focus or something like that, it also has on-off switches for emotions. So emotions come flooding in and they turn way on or they turn off. And then you're kind of cool and you're just going about your life. And that can be great if you're super excited, right? And it kind of matches the situation. And people around you may really, really appreciate that, but it also really hurts a lot when the emotion is one of the more uncomfortable ones. And it can also cause people to kind of spiral, right? Because when you get flooded by an emotion, and that's kind of all you can see, then everything is colored by that emotion, and it starts this kind of downward spiral. But just as a downward spiral can be created with an ADHD brain, an upward spiral can be created as well. The difference in that up and down that happens with ADHD versus bipolar or borderline is that those ups and downs often are related to productivity or to a kind of outside acknowledgement of how you're doing, which is different than a bipolar or borderline. And so that's one aspect of the emotional. The other aspect is that it's really hard to walk around in the world with a brain that doesn't kind of meet that the world's not suited for, right? The world is kind of created for neurotypical brains. The systems in place, the things that are put in place to kind of keep people in check and online and kind of moving along, those were created by neurotypical brains for neurotypical brains. And when a non-neurotypical brain walks around in that world, there's a lot of rubbing that happens, right? There's a lot of ways in which it's exceedingly uncomfortable, and that discomfort is then often translated by the outside world and by the person with ADHD as feeling like, oh, like there's something wrong with me. There's nothing wrong with you. Your brain just doesn't fit the way the world is. And it's a mismatch. That mismatch creates pain and creates suffering that then is carried forward. So every pain, every injustice of kind of that mismatch then carries forward all of the past hurts, right? So when you show up late for dinner and somebody kind of rolls their eyes or makes a comment, even if it's kind of a lighthearted, like, oh, they're late again, comment, that hurts, right? Because it's bringing up the 500 times before that you showed up late, including the time that somebody like totally yelled at you and got super, super mad. So it's bringing along all the baggage of all the past hurt. So these three aspects, the regulation, the practical, and the emotional, they all interplay. And we're going to look at how that works. We often think about kind of ADHD as just being about regulation. And maybe those regulation creates some practical issues, but the emotional is in there too and a really important component. So we're going to look at how they all connect. So we're going to kind of take one side of the triangle at a time. We're going to look first at the practical and regulation connection. This is the one that we're most familiar with. So the regulation issues, again, these are the on-off switches of our brain. They're likely to cause these practical concerns, right? We talked about kind of how they can cause procrastination, but they're also going to cause things like missed details and inconsistent motivation, interrupting, a high startup cost to getting going, incomplete tasks, right? These are all because the brain is either switching on or off, and sometimes not at the times that we want them to, right? And so it's kind of easy to see how regulation causes practical issues, but practical issues actually cause regulation issues as well. So a difficulty in doing the things that then help regulate your brain. And so if you have a hard time kind of getting to bed on time, let's say, if you have a hard time shutting down your work and kind of getting that bedtime routine happening so that you have enough time to actually settle into sleep, then that's going to deplete your regulation stores and you're going to be less regulated the next day, right? That's one way that a practical can impact it. A lot of the things that, and we're going to get into kind of what helps regulation, but a lot of those things, if not all of them, they require attention, they require consistency, right? Because we have to kind of fill those regulatory stores every single day. And they require some planning and some effort. So therefore, they require a lot of practicalities, and they require those practicalities to happen consistently over and over again. So if you're really struggling in the practical realm, it's going to make the regulation a lot harder. So let's now move along the bottom end of the triangle. Again, this goes both ways. Practical impacts emotional and the other way around. So the practical is going to impact the emotional, and this is really kind of those past hurts, right? So let's just say you have some difficulties with planning, and it means that you're having a hard time kind of getting out the door on time and getting to work on time. And that means that every time that you kind of show up at work a couple minutes late, it's going to be more likely for you to feel some shame and guilt, right? And it's going to start to kind of carry along that past hurt. But the emotional impact's practical too, in that it's really hard to kind of do those things, to do the planning, to do that practical work from a negative emotional place. And so if you're feeling, all this guilt and shame from showing up at work late, it's now going to be harder for you to focus and attend and plan out your day, and respond to emails in the kind of system that you normally have, because you're going to kind of be in the swarm of shame and guilt. And that final side of the triangle, emotional and regulation. So again, we kind of talked about how regulation causes emotional issues with that on-off switch, right? It causes this emotional overwhelm, these really, really strong feelings, and then sometimes a shutdown, right? Of this kind of swirling negativity or swirling positivity. I don't want to only stress the negative. There's a lot of swirling positivity that can happen too. These really, really strong feelings, and then kind of none at all. And ADHD brains are more likely to experience those two poles than they are to be kind of somewhere in the middle. But it also goes the other way. So emotional issues, part of the way they cause some regulation issues is that energy kind of flows away from the regulatory abilities. So if your brain is swirling with rejection or swirling with anger, and you're totally inundated by it, it's going to be a lot harder for you to pay attention. It's going to be a lot harder for you to find that middle ground with effort, let's say, right? Because you're going to have all this kind of energy diverted to this emotional storm. Emotionality also makes it harder to do the things that we need to do in order to increase our regulatory capacity. So any corner of this triad can pull up or pull down the others. And that's kind of the good news, bad news here, right? That any single one of those can make the other ones better, but it can also make the other ones worse. So let's look at a couple examples of how this happens. So let's just imagine you forgot to set your alarm one morning, right? And you wake up, it's 5 minutes before you're supposed to leave when you wake up, and you are running around the house and just kind of throwing things in bags, trying to get everything you need, grabbing a yogurt on your way out the door, and yelling at your kids to jump in the car because they need to get to school. Now, your son forgets his shoes. He can't find them. He's running around the house trying to find them. And because you're feeling anxious and kind of tense from this kind of running around and being late, and you're probably feeling a little guilt and shame around that, you're going to be more likely to blow up, right? So you blow up at him, you're yelling, you're screaming, why can't you find your shoes? You can never find your shoes, da 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 da. And you have this kind of big emotional expression of all of that tension. This kicks off a shame spiral, and it kind of drains your energy stores. So even when you get to work, you find it hard to focus. And then as you try to go to sleep that night, you're really kind of stuck thinking about how you acted and not liking how you acted, and why do I always do that? Why can't I, stay more calm? Why didn't I set my alarm? Da 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 da. And now you're not going to sleep as well, which is going to make it harder to do the practical things the next day, right? So the cycle goes in a full circle. But it also goes in a good circle too. So let's just say you have a great new gym routine. And exercise is one of the things that builds up our regulatory stores really, really nicely. So you have a new one and you're really excited about it. It's doing great things for you. And you feel, not only do you feel good about yourself for doing this thing that you've always wanted to be able to do, but you also have more regulatory capacity. So now you have more space and room in your emotional experience. So you're a little less likely to blow up or melt down, right? Rather than before when you're running around the house and everything was crazy, your emotional level was up to here. When you have some good regulatory capacity, you have more space, you have more ability for things to happen and you not to melt down or blow up. So you have that more space and more room. You're less likely to blow up or melt down. And you're feeling so good about yourself that now you're kind of like, I was able to get that gym routine going. Maybe I'm going to try the planning that I was trying to do earlier that I had such a hard time with. Let me get back to that. And so you start this, and now you're kind of like, I was able to do this. Like, it taught me how it works this way in my life. I'm going to apply that lesson here. And now that you're kind of starting to get going with your planning, now you can actually create more space to keep on going to the gym, and maybe also to get to bed on time and get more sleep. And so now you're building your regulatory stores even more. And so the cycle goes in that direction as well. So optimal ADHD management addresses all sides of this ADHD symptom triangle: the regulation, the practical, and the emotional. And as I said, I want to differentiate a little bit between management and treatment. Management, in my mind, is what you're doing for your own ADHD, right? You're the manager of all this, of all these sides, of all the different aspects of your ADHD. And everybody manages it differently, right? Some people are going to have some medication. Some people are going to exercise a whole lot. Some people are going to have coaches or therapists or groups or organizers. I mean, there's such a menu of options, which is so wonderful. I'm so grateful. And so you're the one kind of coordinating that management. And so when we're looking at management, we're looking kind of at this big picture, like what are all the things that are happening? And are they kind of in balance in this moment, or is there something that we need to kind of be addressing to keep things a little bit more balanced? So let's look at what things look like when they're a little out of balance. So a sign of regulation being out of balance, and again, the regulation are those on-off switches, would be having a lot of great systems or strategies. Maybe you've read some really great books or some awesome podcasts or blog articles. You've really kind of worked to create some good systems. Maybe you have an awesome coach on board, but you're struggling to execute them. You know what they are, you're like very clear on exactly how they should play out in your life, and you're just not doing them. You're just not executing on a daily basis. Another possibility would be that you're feeling pretty good emotionally overall. You're feeling relatively good about yourself. And as long as nothing goes wrong, you're cool. But you're kind of primed to explode with this like hair trigger, or super impulsive with whatever kind of the feeling might be, kind of impulsive to act to kind of make the feeling go away. It could also be that your planning or prioritizing is really strong, but you're struggling to kind of stay and focus and attend to what you're planning. So you know exactly what you should be doing, you've broken it all down, you know how to approach it, but when you go to do it, you're kind of off on 5 million other things. These are all symptoms that regulation piece, that kind of basic neurobiology piece, might be needing some more attention. So how do we do that? There are 5 main things that balance regulation. Medication is the first one I mentioned. It is the big one, the big kahuna. Medication is what can really kind of bring extra dopamine into that prefrontal cortex, also norepinephrine and serotonin, and it can really help bring more of that regulatory capacity It can start to turn some of those on-off switches into fader or dimmer switches, and it kind of fills up those regulatory stores. Sometimes I think of a regulatory store as being like a battery on your phone, right? And kind of we're all granted a certain amount on any given day. And if you take some medication, you might fill it all the way up to the top, or maybe not all the way to the top, but closer to the top. Exercise is also an amazing strategy for building up those regulatory stores. So exercise is also one of those additive ones where that battery meter that you're granted at the beginning of the day, you go and exercise and you're going to fill it up even more. You will have to spend a little bit in order to get some, but you'll get more than you spend. Exercise does it in a very similar way as medication, by kind of flooding your brain with dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin. I call them the three musketeers of a happy ADHD brain. That it will really kind of help give your brain what it needs, and also, similar to medication, will actually build up more dopamine receptors so that you can absorb that dopamine that comes in. Exercise is a really powerful strategy. If you're at all interested in the topic, I highly recommend looking at John Rady's work. He does some great stuff. Spark is an awesome book all about exercise and its impact on the brain. Meditation also works to increase that regulatory store, and it will. It also has an additive effect. It creates a little space between stimulus and response, allows you to get a little bit more conscious choice in between stimulus and response, so you're not just responding the second something happens. Sleep is one of those that will help tell you where your battery meter is when you wake up in the morning, right? If you didn't get enough sleep, your meter is going to be a whole lot lower than if you got as much as your body personally needs, your 7 to 9 or whatever. And it's amount plus quality, right? And so that sleep is going to kind of tell you where your baseline is. And the final one is nutrition. Nutrition is not one that we talk about too often, but it's really an essential component because nutrition, our brains use up 50% of our body's blood glucose, which is kind of amazing if you think about how big our brain is in comparison to how big the rest of our body is. So 50% of the glucose in our blood is used up by our brain. And what happens is that when that blood glucose is depleted, which happens relatively frequently throughout the day, particularly if you're not eating that well, and we're going to talk about what well is. What happens is that our brain starts to kind of shut down, but it doesn't want to shut down those things like breathing and your heart rate, right? It's going to shut down in basically reverse evolutionary order. So the things that make us the most human, that like higher order thinking, that prefrontal cortex, that ability to regulate, that's first to go. The very first thing that goes when our blood sugar drops is the ability to make decisions. Is our ability to regulate our attention and our focus, our ability to regulate our activation. And so it's exceedingly important for ADHD brains to have kind of a steady blood glucose, because otherwise we're kind of constantly at the effect of this up and down of our blood sugar. So the big thing to think about here is that sugar, when we get that rush, it's going to feel great, but no rush, no peak comes without a valley. And so keeping things steady, and I'm not a nutritionist, so I'm not going to talk too much about this, but keeping things steady with some complex carbs and fat, and protein is kind of what allows our brain to kind of be happy and have this constant blood glucose going. Okay, so now signs of emotional imbalance. This is again the great systems, but feeling stuck. Like I know what to do, my focus is good, got it, but I'm just like, I'm not doing it. I feel resistant to it, I don't want to, I'm feeling like trapped by it all. That's often a sign that there's kind of an emotional something happening, often some history that's come along with it, that's creating a barrier to it. It could be that your focus or your attention is stronger, but you're still getting derailed by your fear, your anxiety, your self-doubt. So you're able to attend to what you're doing, but you're getting these like waves of anxiety or fear that are coming up and kind of knocking you off course. Or it could be that you're struggling with initiation because of the emotional overwhelm. So you want to get started, you have this to-do list, but you're so overwhelmed by the feelings around that to-do list that you have a hard time getting going on it. So how do we balance the emotional? Therapy is a big one, right? Insight-oriented therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy. Those are what all those silly acronyms are. Those are all different therapies that have some empirical validation for ADHD and other things. And they can really help kind of tease out this emotional component, help you start to kind of heal that history of wounds, and also give you some of those skills for that emotional on-off switch. That's also where DBT skills training or emotional regulation for ADHD training, like my Meltdown to Full Mastery course, comes in, where it's teaching those skills for how to navigate that on-off, how to navigate when you get flooded, how to kind of keep it from derailing your intentions and derailing your goals. But meditation and journaling also need to be mentioned here. Meditation, again, as I said, kind of creates that space between stimulus and response, allows you a little bit more room to actually have some volitional control over what you're doing, and allows you a little bit of separation from the feeling so that you can then kind of act more with intention and act more with both that emotion and that rationality. Journaling allows you to kind of bring forward that history, and again also separate a little bit from the feeling and start to process it on a verbal level, which allows that emotional storm to kind of stop raging so hard, and allows you to kind of get enough distance that you can kind of think your way through it a little bit more. So let's look at signs of the practical being out of balance. This could show up as kind of regulation feeling strong. You're really good at kind of paying attention when you need to. You're suddenly able to read books again or kind of sit through a lecture again. But you're still kind of showing up late or feeling frenzied all the time. That could be a sign that practical realm is a little out of whack. Or maybe you're feeling kind of emotionally skilled, like you have that sense of, okay, I can handle this. I know what kind of my patterns are. I know what those feelings are. I know kind of what to do when those feelings get out of control, but you're still feeling frequently overwhelmed, like there's just too much on your plate, and like you couldn't possibly do it all. Or you're struggling to manage the day-to-day demands of your life. Again, there's too much on your plate, or it's just kind of too much to balance and to try to prioritize and plan your way through. So how do we deal with the practical? Coaching and therapy are great. They can really teach you some structures and strategies and skills and help you kind of apply them. I don't even want to say that. Help you build the ones that work best for your brain and for your life. They can, routines and structures do that too. I often think of ADHD brains as being like water. And water, if you give it no structure, it's a puddle, right? And it kind of just sits there. It can be beautiful, but it just sits there. If you give it some structure and you give it a little tilt, now you have a river. And rivers have beauty. They have so much power, so much energy, right? And that's often what ADHD brains need. They need that structure from outside of itself. We don't ask water to structure itself. We don't ask water to propel itself. We give it some walls and a little tilt, which we do through motivation. And now it has its power. Now it gets to kind of flow on its own and flow the way it's meant to flow. Planning does that as well. Time management strategies. And this is both kind of an awareness of time as well as kind of how to navigate your way through time. And accountability systems. Accountability systems are key because all of those other things, they're great. And when they're new and exciting, they're a lot easier to do, but they all get old. And so accountability kind of keeps you coming back even when things are old or even when things get a little out of whack. So we talked about management, but I also want to look a little bit at treatment. So for those of you who are in some type of therapy, whether that's with a psychiatrist or a psychologist or therapist, it's also important that that treatment is balanced. And again, we're not talking about balance all the time, but is at least kind of looking at all sides of this triangle. So there are a couple things that kind of throw things out of balance. One is our natural drive towards proficiency. We like to be good at things, right? And so we tend to kind of drive towards a thing that's a little bit more comfortable. So if you're somebody who likes things that are relatively hands-on and practical and like neat and tidy, then you're probably going to be more likely to go towards those practical concerns. It might even bother you more than when things aren't neat and tidy, and so you're going to kind of drive towards that. It might be a little harder to kind of get into that like messy emotional stuff, right? Or the other way around. Or if you're somebody who really likes things neat and tidy and you're just kind of like, I just need to focus, then sticking in that regulatory capacity might be where your natural inclination is to go. So we all have these natural inclinations, and that desire to kind of master something can cause us to kind of stay in one spot and get things a little out of whack. And with the next one, that is also true of therapists and clinicians. We also have a natural drive towards proficiency. We also have this desire to kind of stay in a spot where we feel really comfortable and where we feel really proficient. And so you're going to have some therapists who really like to do practical stuff, some therapists who are like all about the emotional and like don't even come near me with a planner. And you're going to have, and then there are some therapists and a lot of psychiatrists who are just going to kind of stay right in that regulatory capacity. And so they're likely to kind of pull in one direction or another too. The other thing that can really get people kind of stuck in this imbalanced place is this if-then thinking. And this is that kind of like magical, if I could just show up places on time, then everything would be okay. I'd feel fine. Or if I could just plan out my day, then it would all be fine. I would feel good about myself. Or if I could just kind of feel emotionally on the ball, then everything will be okay. It's that if then thinking that gets us kind of honed in on one particular problem and trying to solve that one problem and allows us to kind of let go of the other aspects. So as I said in the beginning, balance is created, not found. And in an individual treatment, it doesn't need to be created every single day. So I talk a lot about balance, obviously, and I talk about it in the treatment that I do with folks. But I'm not talking about it every day, and I'm not, spending 20 minutes on regulation, 20 minutes on practical, and 20 minutes on emotional, right? We don't have to kind of stay that regimented about things. You can totally dive deep in one area just with the awareness that it's likely going to kind of have an impact somewhere else, and that we don't want to kind of turn our back on any one spot for too long. So sometimes it's a little easier to kind of see these things when they happen in real life. So I'm going to give you a couple examples. These are obviously not their real names, and also kind of details have been changed to protect people's confidentiality. But I wanted to help you guys kind of see how this can play out in a treatment, because as I said, you guys are the masters of the management, right? You are the ones kind of advocating for yourselves to make sure that the balance is created as much as possible in all these different areas. And so I think it's important to kind of see what can happen when something gets a little out of balance, and also the things that we can do to kind of put them back in balance in an individual treatment. So we're going to talk about Dave. Dave is an IT professional, and he came to treatment really to deal with time management and productivity issues. That was all he wanted to talk about. He was really honed in on that. And when he came to me, he was talking, he was really not sleeping well. He was getting about 4 to 5 hours a night, if that, and very kind of choppy sleep, not exercising, and kind of eating whatever he could, whenever he could, but medication made it really hard for him to eat. So we dove right into the regulatory capacity. He was already on some great meds, and so we had that already taken care of. We started really talking about sleep and exercise and nutrition, and he's very practically minded, and so he really kind of, after some initial resistance, really took to it and started to develop some really awesome strategies for getting some great exercise in his own way, in his own the way that worked best for him and his brain. And he also started to navigate that sleep and nutrition. But it was hard, and it was this kind of constant juggling act. As you all know, when you have some strong meds on board, all those other things are hard to navigate, right? It's hard to navigate sleep with strong meds. It's hard to navigate nutrition with strong meds. And he even found that it was hard to navigate exercise with strong meds. And so it was always kind of this balancing act and kind of putting things together. We spent a lot of time there. And one day he kind of offhandedly said, when things go too well, I start to feel horrible. And that was my big red flag of, we have spent way too long over here in this regulatory area. What's going on for him is that, when sleep is off or nutrition is off, he has somewhere to kind of attend to. But that emotional, that history, that was coming up for him as soon as things got quiet. As soon as things kind of felt more in order, then that emotional stuff started to come up. And so we started to kind of turn our attention. He had that regulatory stuff pretty well in hand, and we started to turn our attention more towards that emotional capacity. And so that's kind of an example of when things get a little too regulatory. There was also a practical component to helping that regulatory capacity. And we are kind of ignoring that emotional side. But it also happens on the other side. So here's Susan. Susan's a 35-year-old who has ADHD as well as some other emotional concerns. And she spends a lot of time talking about emotional issues with her family and her history. She has a very large family that she spends a lot of time with, and there's a lot of complication there. And so she really likes to kind of dive deep into that. That's where she kind of feels the most draw, and I think to some degree feels the most comfortable too. And she sometimes will kind of ask for some more concrete strategies, which I'm always happy to offer. But she takes a lot of space in a session and really kind of uses the session to really dive into that emotional component. That's awesome. However, over time, we've started to, check in on like, okay, how are things going? What are things looking like for you? And she talks about feeling better, about feeling better about herself, feeling better about the family issues. But on the surface, her life actually kind of looks quote unquote worse. She has lost her job. She's showing up late for things more often. She is kind of not making it out of the house as often. So she's emotionally feeling better. She's feeling a whole lot less shame. She's been processing a lot of those emotional components, which is amazing. But we haven't had much space to do that practical work. And so we've been having to kind of open up that space. And the way we do that, by the way, is by really being very forthright about it, right? Of like, oh, okay, so there are three aspects here, and we spent a lot of time over here. I think we need to balance this out a little bit. And let's do kind of like a survey. I often will have people do kind of a bird's eye view of their life and kind of say, like, what's going on here? What are the areas that need a little attention? And I actually have like a form that they can fill out to help them to kind of look at all those different areas to say, oh, okay, time is still kind of a thing, still not showing up on time. And so then we get a little bit more practical there. The final one we're going to look at is Sophie. Sophie is a 30-year-old new professional. She came to treatment looking for help with practical issues like scheduling, getting her notes done, that sort of thing. And she's kind of a new ADHD diagnosis, very enthusiastic, very excited, has been in therapy before, but was super excited to get some like strategies and hands-on work. And so she's made great progress with that. Really got some great strategies on board that she really was able to individualize very nicely. But she, from the very beginning, was kind of like, I've been in lots of therapy before, I've done the emotional stuff, I just want to deal with the practical. And that was great for a little while until we were talking about some issues around planning. And she was kind of feeling some resistance there. And we were kind of exploring that, and she started crying and discussing what was happening, and we realized that like she had really been overscheduled. Her parents had seen her as a kid not having the ability to do that planning for herself, and therefore they overscheduled her and kind of swooped in too hard, leaving her kind of feeling like this petulant child. And so that was happening when she was trying to do it for herself. So we noticed this hurdle and started working on that and started kind of reframing it and reframing what this strategy was. I see this happen a lot, that, there are few novel strategies. If you go to a therapist or a coach or anyone, it's not like anybody's going to hand you this magical strategy that you've never heard of or never thought of before, right? The way that these treatments work is by helping you individualize it to make it really work for your life, as well as to help you kind of stay with it, right? And create that accountability. But it also allows you to kind of see why that strategy is not working. And oftentimes the strategy is not working because it's carrying along some history that kind of needs to be reframed, so that we can kind of shed that history from it and just get the benefit of the structure of the strategy. So if you're the one who's in charge of your ADHD management, then you're also going to be looking at your ADHD treatment. It's one thing to kind of look at the overall picture of the management and say, what do I need to do here? But you're also going to be the one kind of looking at the treatment and saying, like, is this doing it for me? So what do you do if your ADHD treatment or management is feeling out of balance? So there are kind of four things that you can do. The first step is to assess it, right? To kind of take that bird's eye view every so often. Again, you're not going to do this every day. You're not going to do it every week, but every so often, taking a bird's eye view and assessing, is there anything out of balance here? Is there anything that needs a little bit more attention? Anything that I'm not addressing? And, am I getting any of these red flags of, oops, something's calling for my attention over here? The next step is to identify. You're identifying which strategies. So I listed all the different strategies for the three aspects. So which of those strategies is going to be most accessible for you? And by accessible, I mean, is it going to work in your life? Is it something that kind of jives with who you are, right? So insight-oriented therapy doesn't jive with everyone. That's cool. Don't do it. Try a different therapy. Try CBT or DBT that's a little bit more structured and concrete. Or maybe it's not accessible because it's expensive. It is. Even with great insurance, it can be really expensive. And so maybe it's not accessible for that reason. And therefore, maybe reading a book about the emotional impact or doing some journaling or some meditation, maybe that's going to be more accessible for you. So looking at those lists of all those different ways of helping each one of those categories and seeing which one's most accessible, which one can you kind of access the easiest, because the important thing is that we're trying, right? And so you don't need to do all the things all the time. Please don't. You'll burn yourself out. But picking and choosing kind of what works best for you in your life and what you have available, the time, the energy, the financial resources, all of that, that's going to help you get closer to your goal. Also asking. So step 3 is ask. Ask the professionals and people in your life that you already have if they can help bring a little bit more attention or a little bit more care to a missing area. So maybe you'll have a psychiatrist on board, and he is like all about the regulation, but you meet with him every 2 weeks, let's just say. I know normally we don't meet with psychiatrists every 2 weeks, but he's the person in your life, and maybe you need a little bit more time spent on that practical or on that emotional. Ask. Or maybe you have a therapist who really loves to dive into the emotional, but you're really needing a little bit more time spent on that practical, or a little bit more time figuring out how to get your sleep and your exercise in order to build up those regulatory stores. You can ask. And again, as I said, people tend towards kind of their areas of proficiency. You're probably going to be asking people to step outside their comfort zone a little bit. That's okay. That's what we're here for. Good treatment, good mental health treatment professionals are going to want to grow. And if they don't feel capable of growing in that area, they'll help you figure out how to do that. There are books and ways for them to access that information, but they can't know unless you ask. So ask. The last one is to seek. So let's just say you don't have them in your life, or you've asked and they've said, you know what, that's really outside my realm of capability. The next step is to seek out the supports that you need. Chad has so many wonderful support groups and free resources, books, podcasts, blogs. There's so many great free resources out there that even if finances are an issue or a concern, you have access to lots and lots of supports that are free. And so if you can go out in search of it, you can find ways to kind of put together that more balanced treatment. So that's all I have. We have some good time for questions. And these are my sources. You'll have access to my slides so you can look at my sources later and my information. But let me pull up. Claire, do you want me to stop sharing my screen, or is that better?
I think you're still sharing.
Okay. There we go.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
Maybe people can turn their cameras on us if you're comfortable with that, and we see your faces. We had a question or comment. It says, Mike says he has trouble accepting criticism because he only sees it as negative. And his question is this due to my on-off switches in my brain?
So I think it's due to both. So as I said, those emotional concerns, they kind of come from two places, right? It's the on-off switch definitely plays a role in that it has, when you start to kind of feel that negativity as it starts to creep up, it then starts to kind of color your whole perspective. And the way our brains work is that when we have an emotion come up, it then draws all the information and all of the knowledge and memories that we have that are associated to that feeling. It's a really rude thing about our brain. So when we're feeling sad, we think about sad things. And when we feel sad, we're more likely to remember sad things. When we feel happy, we're more likely to remember happy things. And so when you start to feel that negativity from that criticism, it then kind of floods your brain with all this additional negativity, which makes it hard to then kind of get to that place where you're separate enough from that feeling that you say, okay, this isn't all negative, like this is a learning opportunity, right? It makes it hard to get to that, what we call the wise brain, that part of our brain that is able to acknowledge the emotion, but also acknowledge the rationality. And so we get flooded, and it gets hard to kind of get to that place. But it's also about the history. It's also about the fact that when you walk around the world with a brain that doesn't match kind of the way the world has been set up, you get a lot of criticism. And that criticism, particularly when it's given as a child, it gets laid down and kind of understood in this broad way of like, I'm bad. right? I don't have any other explanation for why I couldn't do this thing that everybody else seems to be able to do. I must be bad. And so when somebody criticizes you, that feeling comes up, and now it comes up in floods, and it's hard to kind of get out of that feeling.
You guys are able to unmute yourselves if you want to ask the question yourselves instead of putting it in the chat. Feel free to do that.
I think if I'm the next question, I was interested in how you said the low blood sugar would affect the brain function, and then it made me wonder if then dieting by not eating so much was difficult for the ADHD brain, and then but I would think actually exercise would more commonly offset that. So I was hoping you just kind of speak about that for us.
Yeah, so I am going to first give a big caveat that I'm not a nutritionist, but I will tell you what I know. And so one thing is that dieting can be done in a way that maintains a good steady even blood sugar. And it can be done in a way that doesn't, right? If you're dieting by restricting your calories, but all you're eating are cookies, but you're only going to eat like 2 cookies a day, then you're going to throw your blood sugar way out of whack. But if what you're doing is kind of eating small amounts of oatmeal that are going to kind of keep you going for a long time, and then some nuts, and you're going to keep that nice steady blood sugar, then it's going to be okay. You are right that exercise complicates that picture. This is kind of what I was talking about with Dave in terms of balancing all those different components of the regulatory stores is a really tricky picture, particularly when you add medication in. So add medication and exercise in, and you're going to make nutrition a little bit more complicated. And so one of the things a good friend of mine who's a nutritionist told me is that it's okay to have carbs. Carbs are not bad. You just always want to have an escort to your carb. You never want your carb to come alone. And so if you give some fat and protein along with it, because they just spike at different times, if you give some fat and protein along with it, it'll even out that spike and make it so that you don't do a spike and then a dip. It's that simple sugar that's really going to cause trouble. There is some research, and I'm not going to go into this too much because I don't feel qualified enough, but interesting to look more into the research around intermittent fasting, around kind of maintaining that even blood sugar and the impact that it has on ADHD and brains in general. Did I answer all the aspects to your question?
Yes, thank you. That was wonderful.
Great. Sure. I also see one from Jennifer O'Hara. What aspect of ADHD brain causes default mode network, which is one of my new fun things to talk about these days, so thank you, to become uncontrolled or intrusive? So let me just tell people a little bit about default mode network if you're not aware. Default mode network, we have kind of 2 networks in our brain. We have default mode network and task positive network. Default mode network, I like to call it a shower brain. It's a part of our brain that gets really fired up when we're just letting our brains go, right? We're just kind of like, it's playing around. I think of it as recess for our brains. And it gets to kind of go wherever it feels like. Task positive network is the part of our brains, it's a network of our brains, it's not a part, that gets turned on when we're doing something, when we have something, a goal-directed activity, right? And for neurotypical brains, when one turns on, the other one turns off. For ADHD brains, that's not true. I think that this is a huge part of the distraction, right? That there's just this it's like, I imagine it as like my kid's kindergarten classroom. The playground was right outside his classroom. So if he sat right by the window and kids were playing out there, it was like, how could he possibly pay attention in class, right? That's kind of the ADHD brain. It's like sitting right at the window while somebody's tapping on that window, being like, come play, come on. And you're trying so hard to stay on task. And so the question was, what aspect of the ADHD brain causes default mode network to become uncontrolled? I'm going to go with regulatory. It's mostly regulatory, that regulatory capacity that increases your ability to kind of turn off the default mode network and actually get engaged in something. In order to get into that task positive network, you really need to get activated. You need to get excited and motivated. You need to kind of turn on, right? You need to turn your attention on to something. And so you're going to need some good regulatory capacity to do that. Practical will help for sure. You know, if you put a screen down and kind of get that kid away from that window, it's certainly going to help. There are practical aspects that you can put in place to get away from it, but it's mostly about a regulatory capacity. I also see from VC, how do you recommend dealing with the feeling of emotional overwhelm when someone speaks to you about a stressful topic that affects your being able to focus on what they're saying? Okay, so, and VC, feel free to unmute yourself and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm getting from your question is that when you're being spoken to about something stressful, that stress actually impacts your ability to focus on what the person's saying. Not that you're being stressed by not being able to focus, although that probably also happens. So if that's correct, so how to deal with that? So the first thing is that when we get stressed, what happens is that our bodies go into a fight or flight mode, right? And when we go into fight or flight mode, when we get that stress response, there's just basically a universal stress response. And ADHD brains tend to kind of go to the extreme of that stress response faster. ADHD brains like extremes, so they go there faster. And it can get flooded by it. When we get that stress response, our bodies and our brains are getting prepped to fight, flee, or freeze, right? And when we do that, we need our bodies to be prepared in that certain way. So our muscles tense, our breathing gets really shallow, and our heart rate increases. All of this is just so that we can be in that tip-top fighting stance. Unfortunately, the thing that comes along with this is that our bodies have evolved to say, hey, we don't need that higher order thinking. We need that blood. Let's not put a lot of energy there. We need it really focused on the threat. We need it honed in on that, and we need all of that energy going everywhere else. So our brain's actually, that frontal lobe, that really like good, rational, higher order thinking shuts down. And so it's going to be really hard not just to pay attention. It'll totally be hard to pay attention because it's going to shut down that prefrontal cortex, that ability to kind of stay on task. But it's also going to, even if you could stay on task, it's going to shut down kind of your ability to think through what the person's saying. And it's going to shut down your ability to kind of respond rationally, right? It's the same thing that happens. I don't know if anybody else was really shy in school. I was really, really shy, and I would be called on and I would totally know the answer, but my mind would go completely blank, right? Because that stress response would flood up and my brain would just kind of go offline. And so it's the same sort of thing that's happening. We need to get the brain back online. And the way to do that is to shut down the stress response. And we have one way in to that stress response. We can't tell our heart to slow down. We can't tell our body to get that blood back into our prefrontal cortex or our frontal lobe. We can't even tell our muscles to relax all that well. What we can do is slow our breathing down. So I would, my first piece of advice for you would be to take some very deep breaths, some slow, calming breaths. There are lots of great strategies for this. You can look them up. My favorite happens to be what my son calls roller coaster breathing, where you travel up and down. You breathe in as you go up a finger and down as you go out, down a finger, and then through your 5 fingers. It allows you to calm your breath down. Once you deepen your breath, now your heart rate decreases. Now you start to get that blood flow back. And so giving yourself that benefit of slowing that whole process down. But it may also mean, if somebody is talking to you about a stressful topic all the time, and you might need to have kind of what I call a meta conversation about that, of like, hey, whenever you talk about this, I get really stressed out and I find it really hard to pay attention to what you're saying and to participate in the conversation the way I want to. So I want to have this conversation with you, but I might need to kind of excuse myself and kind of get a little space and calm down and come back and then get some space and calm down, and talk to them about what you need, right? I think one of the biggest, most wonderful things people with ADHD can do for themselves is really first know what you need, start figuring out what you need, and second, asking for it, right? We all have our strengths and weaknesses. We all need things from the world, and we get to ask for them. And so if what you need is to get through this conversation is to kind of step away, take some breaths, come back, step away, take some breaths, come back. Sure, it's going to be a bit of a longer conversation, but you're going to be more able to kind of stay with it and get where you wanted to go with it.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. That was spot on again. You're really incredible. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, VC. Any other questions? John?
I would love to add to that discussion you're just having, and I think it's similar to what you're just saying, but to sort of preempt the situation all on my own. So if I can anticipate a stressful situation, I'll spend a bunch of time thinking all the things that might happen. So when it does happen, none of them are stressful to me. I've already thought about if this happens, I'll do that. If this happens, I'll do that. So and I also want to use the word exposure therapy, where I expose myself repeatedly to that. I was wondering how you'd react to that word for this situation.
Yeah, so I love what you just said, but it also makes me a little nervous. And the reason why it makes me nervous is it gets a little close to kind of anxious thinking, right? And the way that you can make it, and my guess is you've made it adaptive versus anxious, is that you play the tape all the way through. So the difference between that anxious thinking that doesn't get us anywhere and just gets us into anxious mess, versus, oh, I've actually thought things all the way through and now I feel in control of things, is that you go past the natural loop. So we actually, as we were talking about default mode network, you get out of that default mode network and into that task positive on that thought. So rather than, oh, he's going to say, he's going to talk to me about this thing that I find really stressful, and then I'm going to get stressed out. And then, then I'm not going to be able to focus on what he's saying, and I'm not going to get where I want to go, right? And then you just keep going in that loop of oh, he's going to talk to me about this. It's going to be bad. I'm not going to say what I want to say. And you stay there. That's the anxious loop. In order to make that actually effective, and to make it more like exposure therapy, is you say, okay, so then what? So that happens. And now I'm, feeling bad about myself that I wasn't able to say what I want to say. Now what? Now what can I do? well, I guess I could go back to him and I could say, hey, I wasn't able to like comment on that thing, but this is also what I'm thinking. And so when you actually play it all the way through and you keep asking yourself, now what, and you may end up at a place where you don't like. That's okay. When you get it to that place, you ask yourself, can I deal with it? Can I survive that? Right? It might be really horrible. You might not want to survive it. That's okay. You don't have to want to. We're talking about worst case scenarios. But can you? Do you have some resources to help get you through that? And if the answer is yes, then okay, we can handle that, right? Now that's something that you've exposed yourself and you've actually gotten to the other side of it. Yeah. So a couple other questions. John, did I, you good with that? Okay. Jim says, I often explain my ADHD brain to a movie picture screen of thoughts that sometimes go speeding by compared to others. Recently, the thoughts were coming across so quickly, I feel like my brain was actually hurting. At times, the movie screen of thoughts slow down, not sure how or why. Is this a normal ADHD experience? Does this occur with normal brains? I notice stress can increase the speed of thoughts. So yes, this is a very normal ADHD experience. People kind of have different experiences of it, but the racing thoughts, it's not only for ADHD brains, but it is very common among ADHD brains. Other things can also make this worse. Anxiety, stress are going to increase that speed. It is something that if you increase your regulatory stores, it will get better, for sure. So if you have a good night's sleep, and I would encourage you to start to kind of look at those 5 things: the medication, sleep, nutrition, exercise, meditation, and start to see whether they play out in terms of the speed of your thought, Jim. So if you can if you're noticing one day, oh wow, they're really, really fast, just check in with yourself and like, how much sleep did I get last night? Have I taken my meds? When did I last eat? Did I exercise today? Like, check in with yourself on all of those things. And you may start to notice a correlation. Oftentimes people do notice a correlation that the faster the thinking, the more likely it is that those regulatory stores have been pretty depleted, and that when they start to slow down, it is a matter of kind of having more regulatory capacity.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, sure. I think we have, I actually can't see a clock. Yes.
We're at 8:25. I have
Okay.
a question myself, which is partly I guess it's an emotional response to, as soon as I know I need to do something, now I don't want to do it. It's sort of like a self oppositional to whatever has to be done. So I can make my task list. I can say, I'm going to do this from this period to this period, and it all looks like it makes sense. And then I just do something else completely different because I don't want to do that. Where's that coming from? And do you have any suggestions for what to do about that?
So part of me wonders whether there's a piece here that is the 80% rule. I actually like to call it the 60-80% rule, right? Of that for an ADHD brain, once a task has been 60 to 80% complete, it's no longer interesting and no longer needs to be done. And so part of me is wondering whether a piece of what's happening is that once you've kind of thought it through and planned it through enough, it feels like it's no longer new and shiny and interesting. And so anything else is more interesting and shiny. But the other part of me wonders if there is and obviously we're not going to discuss this here, but whether there's a history or some like emotional history around that, right? That this would be similar to when I was talking about Sophie, you know, crying around the planning, right? And kind of feeling like I know what I'm supposed to do, but now I hate doing it. I don't want to do this planning. I know it works for me, but I don't want to do it. And for her, it was really about having been overplanned and overscheduled. It was about this history of people imposing their will on you, and oftentimes kind of a reframing of that, right? Of kind of like opening. I often like to frame planning rather than the structure being imposed on you. It's something that is there to create freedom, right? Because if you do, you know, particularly if you planned, you know, with your energy levels and, you know, what's kind of going to work best at a certain time in mind. So let's just say you're kind of most primed and most ready. Your regulatory capacity is best at like 10 a.m. You've gone for a walk, you've got some meds in your system, you're ready to go. And so you planned your hard stuff then, and you got everything kind of set up. That then opens up freedom to do the fun stuff when later on, right? It opens up freedom to actually act on your goals and intentions. So sometimes it's a little bit about reframing what that structure is, rather than, you know, actually doing away with the structure altogether.
Sounds plausible. It's worth a try. It always is.
I mean, the truth is it's hard. Yeah.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions at this point?
I would love to just add one more sentence to your question there, which I thought was excellent, and I can relate a lot to. And I've been surprised how often when I'm procrastinating a particular individual task and want to choose other things, how often I woefully underestimated how long that particular task would take. Even though I've thought so much about it, I was terribly wrong, and yet somehow I knew I was wrong, that it was going to take forever, but I didn't know. It's very strange, but all the time, those are the tasks that took way longer than I'd accounted for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The other thing I might add in there is the power of accountability and, you know, body doubling and buddy systems, for particularly the hard things, right? And accountability also for the time stuff, right, John, of kind of like, okay, you know, and you're not going to do this all the time, but sometimes if you're like, okay, I think this is going to take about this amount of time, and you run it by your friend who's like, whoa, it would take me like 10 times that amount. And it's like, oh, okay, I might be a little off there. But kind of running things by other people, or having somebody kind of alongside you as you're trying to tackle a hard thing.
Okay. Or promising someone else that it'll be done.
Yep.
Okay. Wonderful. Will your slides be available for me to send to people who are interested?
I will. Okay. Yep, I will send them along to you tonight.
Okay, fabulous. All right, so everybody who logged in tonight, when I get them from Marcy, I will pass them on. And thank you all for coming tonight. If you're not on our email list, I want to remind everybody, if you're not on our email list and would like to be, drop your contact information in the chat bar. And if you don't want to put it for everybody, you can put it to just me. And with that, I want to say thank you to Marcy, and
thank you.
It's been rather interesting. We usually do like a big round of applause at this point.
Yes, thank you so much for coming on, and you did a wonderful job with your presentation.
In closing, I want to say I looked at your website during the intro, and I love that one page, the ADHD Advantage. That was awesome.
So, thanks.
Everybody check out her website.
Yeah, but that particular page, it's like our superpowers, and like, that's awesome.
There are definitely some superpowers there. Thanks, John.
All right. Great. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. I got a couple of. Good night, all.
Night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Claire.
All right. Good night.
And thank you, Bailey.
Yep.